The focus of my talk today will be on the modern state. Again, this word of modern we discussed for quite some time. And I think this state is one of the most prominent gendered power structures of patriarchal capitalism. And as I will argue, the state is an intersectional gendered structure of violence. So I'm not a historian, but a political scientist, so I will not be able to describe the development of state structures since the 16th century, where I would say, well, this is the start of modern politics and the modern state. So I would be very much looking forward when you get research funds that you do the empirical historical work, because as I say, I can't do this, nor am I a global political scientist who would be knowledgeable about state forms and different state structures across the world. So in my talk, I will rather take a political theory perspective to understand the principle of governing people, of exercising power over people through institutions of the modern, and I have to limit, Western state. Of course, I try to, with theory building, and this is a very brief methodological disclaimer, when you build theory, you always have to think about the historical contexts and regional contexts of the theory you want to develop. So this is why I, from time to time, use examples. So historically, the modern state project and the state apparatus are of central importance for shaping the living and working conditions, of course, and for the shaping of the self-image of citizens. And then in the 20th century, the state is already also important for the democratic organization of the struggle for political power. Feminist scholars in the global north have been pointing out since the 1970s that the state is not neutral, that it is not the expression of a common good, but that the state is particular. It is patriarchal and masculinist. However, states transformed and more women, homosexuals, people of color, and working class people are represented in state institutions. Furthermore, a bunch of laws improve the status of marginalized groups of different genders, of racialized and LGBTIQ people, and of course of the working class. These developments, without doubt, changed the wide, heteronormative and masculinist form of modern Western states, but is a higher descriptive, quantitative, and substantive representation a way to abolish intersectional power relations. And I think this has been for a long time the question of feminist political science. I will argue that these transformations only partially changed the power structure of the modern state, and dominance, marginalization, and exclusion are still maintained, although in always changing ways. Thus, to understand the masculinist power structure of the state, an analysis of the presence of men, for instance, in state institutions alone is misleading. The analysis of the masculinist structure of the state, and this will be my argument, needs to locate state masculinism in the multiplicity of social power relations. My historical starting point for theorizing the modern state are changes since the 16th century in Europe. Since then, the state's monopoly of power and physical violence has been justified by a fictitious contract among citizens. So citizens, this is the idea, submit to the state, give up part of their freedom in exchange for protection and security. So the justification, this justification of the state through a contract, for example, in Hobbes, Locke's, or also Rousseau's, these are the usual suspects of contract theory, this justification is typically modern, as it is a sort of secular justification of state rules. And the contract theorists elaborated furthermore subjectless power in contrast to feudal personal rule, as Heide Gerstenberger, a German political scientist, showed in her famous book, Die subjektlose Gewalt. So the state is no longer represented by one human being, but stateness developed into a structure, into institutions of power which organize societies. Subjectlessness of rule is furthermore supposed to establish rationality of the, and especially rationality of the individual's submission to the state and its agencies. Above all, then later, the liberal idea of contract creates the state as a neutral authority, autonomous vis-à-vis the interest of social groups and therefore capable of producing the common good. So while the feudal person representing or being the state could have been a woman, and we heard a lot about this yesterday, the modern state, the artificial god, as Thomas Hobbes labeled the Leviathan, and so this idea of this artificial god, namely the modern state, became male and masculinized. So and this is the difference to feudal ideas of representing or being the state. So the US-American political scientist Carol Pateman did rather early a study about social contract theories of the 16th and 17th century, and she showed that only men were eligible to conclude this contract, from which then the state emerges. Pateman stresses that this contract was no longer patriarchal. It was not a patriarchal state, but a fraternal contract, a state of brothers who revolt against the fathers by excluding women from the public sphere. So the modern state developed a corresponding architecture, an institutional architecture. Max Weber's ideal of modern bureaucracy constitutes state administration or state bureaucracy as a sort of male bonding, as Eva Kreisky labeled the modern state apparatus. And Charles Mills, with the same epistemological lens, criticized the racial contract and showed that the modern state has a racial bias and excludes racialized people from the contract and hence from the modern state. So the emergence of a new state form since the 16th century, these depersonalized, subjectless and masculine state, was located or has to be located in major transformations in early modernity, the development of capitalism, primitive accumulation, also based on colonialism in Africa, plantation slavery in the Americas, and of course, gender exploitation. These transformations of social and economic structures needed a new organization of governance, and this is the modern state. And this state aimed in particular at the reproduction of the population and their integration into the capitalist process. Therefore, the state, the modern state, corresponds with intersectional hierarchies to organize generativity, economic accumulation, and growth. Social inequalities and divisions have been inscribed in this new emerging power structure to guarantee social order, the gender division between production and reproduction, the division of public and private, of the national and the external. The legitimation of modern statehood established thus a dual system of state and family rule that excluded women from the polity and subjugated them under the rule of husbands. In the 19th century, gender became a political category within the framework of a new mode of population. And this is an expression by Ursula Beer, Bevölkerungsweise, stressing that especially then in the 19th century with the emergence of the nation state, the reproduction of the population was focused. This is a similar argument that Michel Foucault also made from a different epistemological point of view. So this mode of new mode of population linked the production, reproduction, and generativity within a closed territory, the nation state. And the reproduction of a binary gender order and gender inequality, thus, in bourgeois marriage and family law simultaneously created exclusion qua sexual orientation. Furthermore, this gendered nation state of the 19th century created exclusionary ethnic and racialized regimes, since capitalist production and reproduction in the global north needed imperialism and slavery. So this constellation, I would say, is reproduced until today by an international gendered division of labor, although, of course, the geographic political landscapes change, but still we have this international gendered division of labor. A further dimension is important. Historically, the differentiated masculinist modes of governmentality developed. And Christine yesterday in her paper also pointed out this Foucauldian notion of governmentality by Foucault, and where he wants to stress that the state is an institution which needs to make people governable. Yeah, so this is mainly the idea, and Foucault with this concept stresses the connection of the modern state with subjectivity, with subject creating or subjectivation, as he names it. So later in my talk, I will go deeper into this, and I will suggest a combination to theorize the modern state. I will suggest a combination of a materialist and hegemony approach with this Foucauldian approach to understand the state. I think this concept also allows to elaborate more how these multiple and intersecting structures of state domination and of power might be subverted, might be transformed and changed. To give an overview how my argument will proceed, I will first develop an understanding of modern statehood which goes beyond the state apparatus. And I think this is important to say the state is not only institutions, not only norms, not only bureaucracy, but the state is more, and I want to develop this notion of the state as a strategic field of forces. In the second step, I want to elaborate on the governmentalization of the modern state and the role of subjectivity. And in the third step, I want to highlight then what does it mean, the state concept, what does this mean to label the state as an institution of intersectional gendered violence. And if there is time left, I will just very briefly suggest perspectives of transformation. So I'll come to my first point. The feminist materialist understanding of the state as a gendered and intersectional arena of power. I want to highlight mainly three aspects. The first aspect I would like to highlight is that materialist and hegemony theories perceive the state not only as a bureaucratic apparatus, as I already mentioned, but different from that, they emphasize the totality of society and therefore the connection between a specific form of the state and corresponding social and economic constellations. So the modern state is conceptualized in this realm of thinking as a social relation or as a social field with conflictual social and cultural differences and inequalities. And these social fields are mainly characterized by capitalist patriarchal power and relations of dominations. So different from contract theories, they also think that there is the population that create the contract. Materialist theories think, well, of course there is this population, but they do not go into a contract, but they struggle in a field which is unequal, where hierarchies exist, where differences exist. So, and in this field of struggles, it's not the contract from which the state emerges, but it's in these power struggles where one could say, well, those groups in society which are most powerful with respect to different resources, they are able to create the state and state institutions and norms and legal entities according to their interests. And the neo-Marxist theorist Nikos Poulantzas, he labeled this process of the emergence of the state out of these societal relations and struggles as a condensation. So he says it's not a contract, but it's a condensation of different power relations which then create the state structure, state form, and state institutions. So, and then we can say, of course, Poulantzas as a Marxist, he was mainly interested in class relations, but we can also say, well, there is a multiplicity of differences and hierarchical constellations and of different groups struggling in these societal fields. So we can also say, well, hierarchical gender relations, heteronormativity is established during these struggles and then is institutionalized in the state. So what is important for me in this realm of thinking is that the state not only organizes hierarchical gender binary or intersectional relation, but that the state emerges from these unequal power relations, so that the relation between state and power and inequality would be always vice versa. So this is, for me, the interesting thing if we think in this theoretical realm. So the state then emerges as a political form that procedures the contradictions of capitalist, patriarchal, masculinist societies by reproducing the inequalities, but at the same time, but by somehow changing also these exclusive societal relations. So divisions, and what are these societal relations? I would say divisions between the social spheres of public and private, between the state, the market, and the boundaries between nation states. So these contradictions include, and the divisions try to somehow procedure these divisions, these contradictions. And these contradictions include, of course, the control of generativity, the capitalist organization of production, but also colonial and imperial exploitation and domination. So these divisions and contradictions reproduce then inequalities by institutionalizing historically and of course regionally specific border regimes, how I would label this, and classifications of people. So, and these border regimes and classifications of people are established or institutionalized, of course, in state borders, in the nation state borders, and citizenship laws, which are rather different and referring, of course, then to the necessities of the countries. But they are also, these border regimes are also institutionalized by marriage and family law, but also by property laws. So the second point in this theoretical realm is that the bureaucratic state apparatus, its practices and norms are the institutionalization of multiple and intersecting structures of inequality. So it's not only, and I said that before, it's not only gender inequality, it's not only class inequality, which is institutionalized, but it's also sexuality, ethnicity, race, but also, of course, religion. And these are more recent debates again. But we have this, of course, the religious war and the war against churches and so on. So religion is also important. So we could say that the state is a mechanism through which these multiple structures of inequality attain social and political significance. So, and this is an important aspect of the state. So what does the state do? The state makes these differences significant by institutionalizing them in laws. And these are, of course, long processes. This is not going on from one day to the other. So they make social inequality, the state makes social inequalities become intelligible and thus socially but also politically relevant. So, and we have then rather complex interfaces and modes of these condensation of social structures, which are constructed in these social struggles about the meaning of differences and their political relevance. So modern state institutions are characterized by hierarchical gender binary, by heteronormativity, by ethnicized and racialized structures of inequality. And we can always see that gender as an institutionalized state structure has been determined by sexual orientation, but also by class and by race and ethnicity. So, and it's state institutions and norms which combine, let's say, these hierarchies and these structures of inequality. So in the state struggle, we could say, for social order and protections, inequalities are combined and interlinked, but they can also be strategically separated, making some of these different structures appear more significant than others. So examples are historically for this separation of class inequality from gender in the institutionalization of the welfare state compromise and of welfare state institutions, where one could say that the class compromise overruled somehow the gender compromise, although the gender compromise has always been introduced into welfare state institutions, but in a marginalized way. And of course, this has a tradition in the labor movement of the 19th century, where women of the labor movement always claimed their right and saying, well, we have special conditions as working class women, but in this struggle for this welfare state compromise, gender issues were sidelined within the male labor movement. And another example would be today the combination of gender and religion, mainly in debates about banning Muslim body covering, where gender and religion are linked in a way that is exclusive for Muslim groups from European states. So the third point I want to make, that this materialist perspective on social relations and forces includes the state as being characterized as a compromise. So this is already what Poulantzas said. So that not to say, well, we have unequal gender relations and booms, this transfers automatically into gender unequal state. But we have to think that in these struggles, the groups, they have always to go into a compromise to establish their interests then in state institutions and state norms. So the modern state is not a uniformly acting institution with one logic, either to oppress women or to establish the needs and interests of a male class, for instance. But we have always to see that the state is, let's say, this is the name, the label of Poulantzas, a relatively autonomous actor towards different groups. So we can have a perspective saying, well, on this state terrain, in these struggles, new forces can emerge, new forces can develop, which are able or might be able to change oppressive and exploitative masculinist relations. So I would say historically the welfare state, but also today equality laws and institutions are such transformative politics. So we can see that the modern state is able to transform. So my second aspect is the hegemony perspective, or the perspective then on subjectivation. What I have said so far, I think, immediately raises the question why people then submit to state norms and to domination. Why do they allow to be voluntarily governed? And here, I think the Foucauldian approach adds an important perspective on the subject, and Foucault stresses that the state is a process or a practice of subjectivation, of creating subjects and of people submitting to become a state subject. So the concept of subjectivation stresses that social positions and identities, also unequal positions, are not simply imposed by force, not simply imposed by state norms and institutions, but they have to be appropriated by individuals. So individuals have actively appropriate these state norms. And this is what Foucault stresses, because especially he says the liberal state is based on the notion of freedom. Of course, this is an ambivalent freedom, but nevertheless, governing through freedom or with freedom in capitalist bourgeois societies also requires a sort of self-government, so that people themselves submit to state norms and just acquire these masculinist, racist, and classist notions of the state. So the state has, therefore, the potential and the power to govern people from above, but not only from above. The state has also the power to encourage self-government by, for instance, making people believe and perform binary gender relations and identities. So in order to exercise power, the modern state must become a practice of people. So the state must be lived, otherwise it cannot exist. Otherwise it would, we don't know, implode, break together. So these state practices have to be anchored in people's minds, hearts, and especially in people's bodies. And therefore, gender and sexuality and race are so important. They receive meaning in this state process because they can be attached, though voluntarily, but they can be attached to people's bodies. And I think this is also important why the authoritarian right today also jumps on gender, sexuality, and ethnicity or race to create their new anti-democratic state project, because they know the body is important in these processes. So earlier than Foucault, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci had already highlighted in a similar way that the state does not only act through coercion, but that it also acts with the help of persuasion or consciousness building. Therefore, the task of state apparatuses is to produce a sort of social consensus in collective practices so that people believe in the state. And this is the Gramscian concept of hegemony, that the emergence of the state is connected to these beliefs and the meanings that are made important in the state project. So following Gramsci and Foucault, gendered statehood can thus be described as a hegemonic practice that produces and prefers certain identities, but marginalizes and disarticulates others. And this is always, I would say, at the interface with other subject positions, not only gender, but also class, ethnicity, race, and sexuality. And this is also what Foucault would label a process of normalization, so making specific identities normal, making gender binary normal, making racism normal. So, and the next point is, what does this mean now for the state and violence? Well, I try, and Dorothee already told, I try to conceptualize violence ingrained as in the structures and processes of modern states. So the institutionalization of modern states has been based on violent social structures of capitalism, of colonialism, and exploitation of women's labor. So in this process of state condensation, these violent structures have been transposed into state practices and state institutions. So the myth of the modern state's monopoly on physical violence and on state masculinism, but also gender and intersectional violence are somehow homologous structures. They are somehow established in long historical processes, parallel processes, maybe simultaneously, but not with the same origin. So I would say this state violence, intersectional and gender violence is contingent. But nevertheless, both violencia, the use of physical force, and potestas, meaning power to regulate, both are masculinist since early modernity. And in a double way. So first we could say, of course, the state apparatus which emerged and which enforces the monopoly on violence was literally mainly the military and the police, although we know that this has also been a historical process where this madness had to be elaborated. But this was the trajectory to make this state apparatus manly. But second and more important, the state monopoly on violence was enforced in gendered structures as it emerged historically in a tense relationship, not only to the violence of gangs of soldiers, how Charles Tilly labeled it, but also in relation to the household. So these were two contesting forces. So male authority or patrimonial authority, as Max Weber writes, rested on the physical ability of the male head of the household to protect the household against these warrior gangs and against feudal despotism. So the modern state was established on the basis of a bipartite principle of rule and violence. First, bureaucratic, military, official state violence, and second, of domestic, paternal violence. So to enforce its monopoly and violence against the feudal lords, the modern state transferred part of its monopoly and violence to the male head of families and gave family patriarchs the right of legitimate physical violence in their domain of so-called privacy. The systematic insecurity of women is thus an imminent dimension of modern states, since the modern state's monopoly and violence, from which it actually derives its legitimacy, but this monopoly on violence did not guarantee security for women in the so-called private sphere. The modern state created state-free zones of violence, leaving a security gap in the space that constituted, or which constituted and remained male power. So the gender binary established the illusion of state sovereignty on the one hand, and at the same time produced insecurity qua gender and deprived familiarized persons of state protection. This violent and violating state structure reflected social power relations in the early process of capitalist accumulation. The mobilization of the emerging bourgeois class to become economically competitive was compensated by privatized reproductive work and by the power of disposal over privatized people. Early modern femicides played a symbolic and disciplining role, and at the same time facilitated violent, primitive accumulation. The constitutional state of the 18th and then 19th century, the rule of law, which was supposed to tame this state of violence and offer protection to citizens, preserved this inherited fraternal masculinist regulation of gender relations, and therefore remained within the state continuum of gender violence. The new mode of population, furthermore, needed the normation of heterosexuality and established violence against homosexuals. However, Foucault showed that this process of governmentalization of the state included also other actors, such as medicine and, of course, the church, into these normation and normalizing processes. So self-governing became historically important for sexual contact, and this also included violence against oneself. The nation-state's violence since the 19th century against feminized citizens corresponded to the violent colonial subjugation of externalized and colonialized others, not least through the establishment of the idea of the nation-state and national identity. Colonization exported private and capitalist violence of accumulation and generativity to subjugated region. The modern state developed as both an arrangement of masculinist and of colonial oligopoles of violence and not monopoly of violence. So the gender-specific violence structures of modern statehood has been also preserved in the arrangement of the welfare state, if we go further on, of the 19th and the 20th century. While the welfare state reduced the violent nature of wage labor, it handed down violence to familiarized and externalized or colonized persons. The welfare state produced gender inequality through the institutionalization of a class compromise, but this included redistributive violence of the welfare state because it can be labeled as violence of omission because all care work was excluded from this welfare state compromise and wasn't taken care of, it was just omissed. Care work was neglected and remained familiarized with all its violent then effects. So the private sphere of the family until recently was a state exclave, a private zone of violence tolerated by the state's monopoly of violence. Until the 1990s, marriage laws police action and jurisprudence formed an opportunity structure for male violence against women. However, as public patriarchy, how the welfare state is labeled, this welfare state partially deprived the male oligopolies of their power of disposal over women and enabled women to lead independent lives. Thus, state violence is transformative and changed historically and can be changed. So after decades of mobilization of women's movements against male violence, Western states established regulation through which the state enforced its physical monopoly on violence in this so-called private spheres. And I think these laws are revolutionary with respect to violent gender relations, as Western states now declare violence in the private realm as an official offense. So, and this gives state actors the right, for instance, to expel perpetrators from the home. And these successes can also be located again in the transformation of social relations and forces, which aimed at including women into the labor market, for which private violence is seen as dysfunctional. However, the number of femicides rose even during this stage of progressive neoliberalism, and these high numbers of femicides point to the ongoing authoritarian and disciplining role of gender relations and capitalist masculinist societies, and the role of violence in this disciplining relations. So the successes of the women's movement are ambivalent. The discourse, and just to give one more example, the discourse on the punishment of violence in the private sphere contributed also to the securitization, not only of gender relations, but of the whole private sphere. And moreover, the violence protection debate fueled exclusionary and stigmatizing debates about the particularly violent nature of migrant and especially Muslim communities. So such post-colonial constellations of violence have been revealed in all their complexity and ambivalence in the debates about sexual violence in the New Year's Eve 2015 and in Cologne. So the indispensable state protection against sexual violence has been reinterpreted in the context of migration as protection against the violent others. So I think the last example shows that reducing violence to gender violence alone is somehow misleading. Therefore, I would say that and this needs, again, much more empirical work, that also in the field of violence, we have to look at the multiplicity of forms of violence and how they intersect, and of course then of the paradoxes or contradictions of law, which are seen to protect from violence. But I think this intersectional view on violence is very important. So very briefly, and I'm talking already too long, what are perspectives on transformation? So I think conceptualizing the modern state as an arena of struggles, as masculinist and intersecting power structures, and as a process of subjectivation opens up perspectives for agency, and this is also for change in, with, but also always against the state. But the concept also highlights that this potential for change is limited So as I started my talk, the integration of women, LGBTIQ people of color into state institutions does not guarantee a transformation of the state towards more equality, does not guarantee a trajectory to more equality and less hierarchy. It's always contested. However, this descriptive, the quantitative representation in parliaments, in administration, does provide a position in the state field of contestation and struggles. So the nature as a state of the state as a compromise between different social forces opens then the possibility of transforming structures of inequality by all actors involved. This is why it's so important that actors are involved. So also I would say that these, in the state process and in state practices of subjectivating people in intersectional ways, these identities, these groups of people are always, the subjectivities are always over-determined, so by different power structures and by different identities. And I think this overdetermination also contains potential for action, for agency, for freedom, and for resistance. So, and just briefly, maybe we could discuss this later, only some examples. I think we have now strikes in hospitals in Germany and in Austria, which were unthinkable before, but especially after the pandemic, it became clear that care work is essential work. And now also the trade unions support these strikes for better working conditions, for higher wages. So I think this is one, let's say, optimistic example to look at. Also, organizations of 24 hours migrant in-house care workers are now they are organizing themselves, although it was thought to be impossible 10 years ago because they are so separated, but they are organizing and saying, well, we do important care work. So this is, I would say, these are examples where we can see that there are intersectional struggles against institutionalized violent structures of the state. Of course, we can also look at right-wing authoritarian actors who want to re-traditionalize family laws, but there is also contested so-called new fathers who claim not to be only breadwinners, but who want also to be fathers. So there is a lot of struggle going on, not naming, and I didn't go into this, activism against climate catastrophe, which are also intersectional struggles. So thanks so much for your patience.